"Excuse me, sir, but is that thing even safe to use?" The cadet's voice carried across the firing line with the particular confidence of youth that has never been tested. He was 19 years old, wearing a brand new ROTC uniform with creases sharp enough to cut paper, and he was pointing at the rifle scope mounted on the old man's weapon like it was a museum piece that had wandered onto the range by mistake. The old man, white-haired, lean as a fence post, wearing a faded field jacket with no visible insignia, didn't respond. He simply continued setting up his position at the far end of the firing line, moving with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who had stopped caring about other people's opinions a very long time ago. "Seriously," another cadet chimed in, lowering his voice just enough to pretend he wasn't being heard. "That scope looks like it belongs in my grandfather's attic. Think someone should tell him this is a marksmanship competition, not an antique show." If you believe that experience outweighs appearance and that some things only get more valuable with age, comment "Respect your elders" and stay with me for this story. The annual Governor's Marksmanship Challenge had been held at Camp Ridgeline for 37 years. It brought together ROTC cadets from 11 universities, National Guard sharpshooters, and a handful of civilian competitors who qualified through regional events. The prize wasn't much. A trophy, a certificate, bragging rights for a year, but for the young cadets building their military resumes, it was a chance to prove themselves in front of the brass who came to observe. This year's competition had drawn 43 competitors. 42 of them carried modern precision rifles with state-of-the-art optics, Night Force, Vortex, Schmidt and Bender, scopes that cost more than some people's cars, with digital readouts and ballistic computers and turrets that clicked with Swiss watch precision. The 43rd competitor carried a rifle that looked like it had been pulled from a time capsule. It was an M40, the Marine Corps sniper rifle that had served from Vietnam through the early years of Iraq, and mounted on top was a Redfield 3 to 9 times scope that had clearly seen decades of hard use. The bluing was worn off the adjustment turrets. The eyepiece showed the faint scratches of 10,000 hours of cheek weld. The power ring moved with the slightly stiff resistance of old lubricant. To the cadets with their modern optics and their tactical accessories, it looked like a joke. His name was Master Gunnery Sergeant William Cafferty, United States Marine Corps, retired. But nobody at Camp Ridgeline knew that yet. The registration form just said, "William Cafferty, civilian competitor," and the young sergeant handling check-in had barely glanced at the old man before assigning him to the last firing position on the line, the one closest to the portable toilets, furthest from the covered viewing area where the VIPs would be watching. Cafferty hadn't complained. He simply took his position assignment, collected his competitor number, 43, and made his way to the far end of the range. He was 74 years old. His hair had gone completely white in his 50s, and his face carried the deep tan of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors. His hands were steady, remarkably so for his age, and his eyes, behind a pair of simple wireframe glasses, still held the particular quality of focus that comes from decades of looking at the world through a rifle scope. The cadets didn't notice any of this. They noticed the scope. "I'm telling you," the first cadet, his name was Patterson, and he was the top shooter in his ROTC battalion, said to his companions, "Someone should really say something. It's almost sad, you know. Old guy probably thinks he's still got it, doesn't realise equipment has advanced since the Stone Age." The competition format was straightforward. 3 stages, increasing difficulty. Stage 1, 10 rounds at 300 yards, static targets, unlimited time. Stage 2, 10 rounds at 500 yards, timed, 2 minutes total. Stage 3, 10 rounds at 800 yards, with a 15-second interval between each shot. Highest combined score wins, simple in concept, brutal in execution. The wind at Camp Ridgeline was notorious. A swirling, shifting beast that came down from the mountains and played havoc with even the most carefully calculated shots. At 800 yards, a 5-mile-per-hour shift could move a bullet's impact point by a foot or more. The cadets had trained for this. They had wind meters and ballistic calculators. They had apps on their phones that computed atmospheric density, temperature gradients, and Coriolis effect. They had everything modern technology could provide to turn the art of long-range shooting into a science. William Cafferty had a notebook. It was a small green notebook, weathered and worn, filled with handwritten data tables and range cards that had been compiled over decades of shooting in every climate and condition the world had to offer. And he had the scope the scope that hadn't been adjusted since 1969. Competitors, you have 15 minutes before Stage 1 begins. Confirm your zero and stand by. The range officer's voice crackled over the loudspeakers, and the firing line came alive with activity. 42 competitors began the ritual of confirming their equipment, dry firing, checking turret settings, consulting their electronic devices for last-minute environmental data. At position 43, William Cafferty did something different. He simply lay down behind his rifle, settled into a position that looked as natural as breathing, and waited. No practice shots, no adjustments, nothing. Patterson, 3 positions down, watched with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "He's not even going to confirm zero," he whispered to the cadet next to him. "That scope probably couldn't hold zero on the drive here, let alone... Competitors, Stage 1, 10 rounds, 300 yards. You may fire when ready." The line erupted in controlled thunder. Cafferty moved like water flowing downhill, smooth, unhurried, inevitable. He worked the bolt of the M40 with the kind of unconscious efficiency that only comes from repetition beyond counting. His breathing never changed. His position never shifted. Every 4 seconds, another round left the barrel, another brass casing ejected and tumbled onto the mat beside him. 10 shots in 40 seconds. Then he simply stopped, worked the bolt to show clear, and waited. Patterson had finished his string as well. 10 careful shots, each one preceded by a glance at his wind meter and a small adjustment to his scope. He was confident. He had been shooting competitively for 3 years, had won his battalion championship twice, and had never finished below third in any match he'd entered. He glanced down the line at the old man with the antique scope and felt something he would later recognise as the first small seed of doubt, because even from 50 feet away he could see that Cafferty's target, the one being pulled down from the 300-yard berm, looked different from the others. It looked like it had been punched by a single, perfectly centred hole. Stage 1 results are posted. The electronic scoreboard at the range tower flickered to life. 43 names, 43 scores. Patterson scrolled down the list, looking for his own number. 92 out of 100. Respectable. Very respectable, actually. In the top 10. Good enough to keep him competitive for the overall win. Then he saw position 43. 100 out of 100. 10 shots. All of them centre mass. All of them touching, forming a single ragged hole that the scoring system had marked as a perfect score. Patterson stared at the number. Then he looked down the line at the old man, who was sitting peacefully on his shooting mat, drinking water from a battered metal canteen and writing something in his worn green notebook. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "That scope. There's no way." But it was possible. And it was only Stage 1. Stage 2 changed the calculation. 500 yards, 2 minutes to complete 10 shots. The wind, which had been relatively calm during the first stage, was beginning to pick up, gusting to 8, 10, 12 miles per hour, shifting direction every few seconds. The cadets consulted their devices frantically, trying to find patterns in the chaos. At position 43, Cafferty closed his notebook, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and lay down behind his rifle. He picked up a small handful of dust from beside his mat, let it trickle through his fingers, and watched how it drifted. Then he settled his cheek against the stock and became perfectly still. "Fire when ready." The thunder resumed, but this time it was more ragged. Shots came at irregular intervals as competitors waited for windbreaks, tried to time their triggers to the brief moments of calm between gusts. Some fired quickly, trusting their calculations. Others burned precious seconds waiting for conditions that never quite arrived. Cafferty fired like a metronome, 1 shot every 12 seconds. No hesitation, no waiting, no visible adjustment to the scope that everyone had already written off as obsolete. He simply read the wind, read it with his eyes and his skin and 50 years of accumulated intuition, and placed each shot exactly where the math and the moment said it needed to go. 1 minute and 47 seconds, 10 shots, 10 impacts that the spotting scope showed were clustered in a group you could cover with a coffee cup lid. Patterson's hands were sweating. He had fired 10 shots as well, but 3 of them had caught unexpected gusts and drifted to the outer rings of the target. He was looking at an 87, still good, still competitive, but no longer in first place. The scoreboard updated. Cafferty, 98 out of 100. 2 rounds just barely outside the centre ring. The best score of Stage 2 by 6 points. Combined score, 198. Perfect was 200. Nobody had ever shot 200 at Camp Ridgeline. Nobody had ever come within 5 points. Patterson walked down the firing line. He couldn't help himself anymore. The curiosity had grown beyond what his pride could contain. "Sir," he said, approaching position 43 with considerably more respect than he had shown earlier. "That's some impressive shooting." Cafferty looked up at him. His eyes were calm, patient, utterly without ego. "Thank you, son." "I was wondering. That scope." Patterson hesitated. "It's a Redfield, right? Older model?" "Redfield AccuRange. 3 to 9 times 40. They stopped making them in the 80s. The old man ran his hand along the scope's worn body with something like affection. This particular one was manufactured in 1968. Patterson did the math. 56 years. 56 years old and outperforming technology that hadn't existed when it was built. "Can I ask when you last zeroed it?" The question came out before Patterson could stop himself. It was the question everyone on the line wanted to ask. The question that had been burning since the first perfect score went up on the board. Cafferty was quiet for a moment. He looked at the scope, then out at the range, then back at Patterson, with an expression that was difficult to read. "Son, this scope was zeroed on September 14th, 1969. Firebase Alpha 4, Quang Nam Province, Republic of Vietnam." He paused. "I have not touched the adjustment turret since." Patterson felt the world shift slightly under his feet. "You're telling me that scope has held zero for 55 years, give or take?" The old man shrugged slightly as if 55 years of perfect mechanical consistency was barely worth mentioning. The Redfield was the best glass made in those days. Solid mount, solid construction, no fancy features to break or drift. The rifle's been properly maintained, stored at constant temperature and humidity. The scope has no reason to move. He patted the worn stock of the M40. "We understand each other, this rifle and me. Been through a lot together." Words spread down the firing line faster than the shifting wind. The old man's scope hasn't been adjusted since Vietnam. By the time the 15-minute break before Stage 3 began, a crowd had gathered at position 43. Cadets who had been mocking the antique equipment an hour earlier now stood at a respectful distance, watching as the white-haired shooter methodically prepared for the final stage. 800 yards, the distance where everything got hard, where the difference between equipment became negligible compared to the difference between shooters, where the wind could turn a perfect hold into a complete miss, and where only experience and intuition could compensate for what technology could not predict. The range officer, a major with jump wings and a combat patch, had noticed the gathering. He walked down the line and stopped at position 43. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, sir." Cafferty didn't look up from his preparations. "Just getting some attention I didn't ask for." The major looked at the rifle. His eyes lingered on the scope, on the particular wear pattern of a piece of equipment that had been used hard and maintained well, for longer than most of the shooters here had been alive. "That's an M40A1, he said quietly. "Original configuration, Vietnam-era." "Yes, sir, serial number 2567. One of the first 100 built. Belonged to the Marine Corps until 1975. He paused. "Belonged to me since 1969. The major's face changed. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. "You were a shooter," it wasn't a question. "I was." Cafferty finally looked up. 27 months in country, 3 tours, 2nd Marine Division, scout sniper. The gathered cadets went silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of embarrassment, but the deeper silence of young people suddenly realizing they were in the presence of something they had only read about in history books. Stage 3, competitors. The announcement broke the spell. 800 yards, 10 rounds, 15-second intervals, take your positions. The crowd dispersed, but the silence remained. And as 43 competitors lay down behind their rifles, every one of them was suddenly aware that the old man at the end of the line was shooting in a different competition entirely. He wasn't trying to win a trophy. He was proving something that had nothing to do with scores or standings. He was showing them what 55 years of dedication looked like. The first shot went downrange like a conversation with the wind. 800 yards is a different world than 300 or even 500. At that distance, the bullet is in the air for over a full second. It rises, arcs, falls. It is pushed and pulled by every gust, every thermal, every inconsistency in the atmosphere between the muzzle and the target. And at that distance, The shooter is no longer aiming at where the target is. He's aiming at where the target will be when the bullet arrives, predicting the future, calculating the invisible, trusting in physics and experience and something that cannot be taught from books. Cafferty's first shot struck 1 inch left of centre, 3 inches high. At 800 yards it was essentially perfect, well within the scoring zone that would earn him maximum points. But he frowned slightly, as if the result disappointed him. He made no adjustment to the scope, none at all. Instead, he shifted his position almost imperceptibly, held for 2 breaths, and sent the second round downrange. Centre. Dead centre. The next 8 shots were a masterclass in what happens when a human being achieves complete harmony with a mechanical device. Each round left the barrel in response to a wind call made by instinct rather than instrument. Each round flew true not because the scope had been adjusted, but because the shooter had adjusted himself, his hold, his timing, his release, to compensate for conditions that change between every shot. When the final round was fired, the 10th shot, 15 seconds after the 9th, the range fell silent. Not because the competition was over, but because everyone was waiting for the spotting scope report from 800 yards. Position 43, 10 shots, group size. The range officer's voice faltered. He adjusted his spotting scope, looked again, then continued with a note of disbelief. Group size, 4.7 inches, all-round scoring, 4.7 inches, at 800 yards, in swirling, unpredictable wind, with a scope that hadn't been adjusted since before most of the shooters here were born. Patterson, still lying behind his own rifle, closed his eyes. His final group had been nearly 18 inches. He was a good shooter, better than good actually, one of the best in his ROTC program, but he had just watched something that good shooting couldn't explain. The final scores were posted. Cafferty, 294 out of 300, the highest score in the 37-year history of the Governor's Challenge, higher than the National Guard snipers with their military training, higher than the civilian competitors with their custom rifles, higher than any cadet who had ever passed through this range. The second-place finisher, a Master Sergeant from the Guard who had been shooting competitively for 20 years, had scored 271, 23 points behind an old man with an antique scope. There should have been a ceremony. There would be a ceremony later, the trophy presentation, the handshakes, the photographs. But first, something else happened, something that wasn't on the schedule. It started with Patterson, the cadet who had dismissed the antique scope, who had wondered aloud if the old man should even be on the line. Patterson walked to position 43, stopped 3 feet from where Cafferty was packing up his equipment, and snapped to attention. He saluted. It was not a casual salute, not the half-hearted gesture of someone going through the motions. It was a parade ground salute, sharp and precise, held until the old man looked up at him. "Sir," Patterson said, his voice slightly unsteady, "I owe you an apology, and I owe you my respect." Cafferty stood slowly, his old knees protesting. He returned the salute, not with military precision but with something that carried more weight, the acknowledgement of one soldier to another, across the gulf of years and experience that separated them. "No apology needed, son. You learned something today. That's worth more than any trophy." But Patterson wasn't finished. "Sir, I was hoping, if you're willing, that you might teach me." He hesitated. Not just about shooting, about... He gestured at the rifle, at the scope, at everything the old man represented. About all of it. How to really do this. How to be the kind of shooter who doesn't need the electronics and the gadgets and the shortcuts, Cafferty said quietly. The things that do your thinking for you. Yes, sir, exactly. The old Marine was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the range had gone still. Other competitors had stopped packing up. Other cadets had drifted closer. The major with the jump wings was watching from a respectful distance, making no move to restore order or clear the range. "That scope," Cafferty said finally, picking up the rifle and holding it where the light caught the worn metal, "has been my partner for 55 years. We went to Vietnam together. We came home together, and a lot of good men didn't. I've carried this rifle on 4 continents, through 3 wars and more training exercises than I can count. I've fired over 200,000 rounds through this barrel, and I've replaced it 4 times. But the scope..." He tapped the red field gently. "The scope has never let me down." He looked at Patterson, then at the other cadets who had gathered around. "You want to know why I never adjusted it? Why, I've never touched those turrets since 1969. Heads nodded. The silence was absolute. Because on September 14th, 1969, I zeroed this rifle on a ridgeline in Quang Province. The next morning I used it to save 17 Marines when our patrol walked into an ambush. I made shots that day that I still don't fully understand. Shots across valleys, through wind and rain, at targets that should have been impossible. His voice grew quieter. When we got back to base, I looked at this scope, and I made a promise. I told her that if she kept doing her job, I would never ask her to be anything different than what she was that day. 55 years later, she's kept her promise, and I've kept mine. The Major stepped forward. His face was unreadable, but something in his posture had changed. Something that spoke of recognition, of connection, of a shared language that civilians could never fully understand. Master Gunnery Sergeant Cafferty, he said. Not a question. I thought I recognized the name. You were at Hugh City. You were with 2/5 during Tet. Cafferty nodded slowly. I was. My father talked about you. The Major's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it that wasn't. Sergeant Major David Reyes, he was a corporal in your platoon during the battle for the Citadel. The old man's eyes widened, then softened. Little David, the kid from El Paso who couldn't grow a mustache to save his life. He smiled, a real smile, warm and sudden. He made it home. He made it home because of you. The Major's military bearing cracked slightly. He told me the story 100 times. How a sniper covered their withdrawal when they got pinned down in a courtyard. How he watched the enemy positions just stop firing, one by one, because someone on the rooftops was eliminating them faster than they could find cover. He gestured at the rifle in Cafferty's hands. He said the sniper was shooting through smoke and debris, making impossible shots, and never missed once. He paused. He said he never got to thank that sniper, never knew his name, but he described the scope, said it was the most beat-up piece of equipment he'd ever seen, even then, said it looked like it had been to hell and back. Cafferty said nothing. He didn't need to. The ceremony happened eventually, the trophy was presented, the photographs were taken, but the real victory of that day wasn't captured in any official record. It lived in the handshakes that followed. 42 competitors lining up to shake the hand of a 74-year-old man who had shown them what mastery really looked like. It lived in the questions they asked about windage and holdover, about trigger control and breathing, about all the things that technology could assist but never replace. And it lived in the decision that was made 3 weeks later, when the Governor's Challenge Committee announced the creation of a new award, the Master Gunnery Sergeant William D. Cafferty Excellence in Marksmanship Award, to be given annually to the competitor who best exemplified the combination of skill, discipline, and respect for the craft that had been demonstrated that day in Camp Ridgeline. The award wouldn't go to the highest scorer. It would go to the shooter who showed the most growth, the most dedication, the most willingness to learn, because that, Cafferty had told them, was the real measure of a marksman. Not the equipment, not the score. The willingness to keep getting better. Cadet Patterson won that first award. He had spent the months between the competition and the ceremony, travelling to Cafferty's small home in rural Pennsylvania, learning from the old Marine every skill that couldn't be taught from a manual. How to read wind by watching grass and leaves. How to calculate range by the apparent size of known objects, how to stay calm when everything around you was chaos, and how to care for a rifle so well that it would still be shooting true 55 years later. The scope, that ancient, worn, unchanged scope, sits now in a display case at Camp Ridgeline's training facility. Cafferty donated it after his eyesight finally began to fail, 3 years after that competition. The rifle is there too, maintained by a rotation of volunteers who learned proper maintenance from the man himself. Once a year, on the anniversary of the competition, the rifle is taken from its case. A single round is fired by that year's Cafferty Award winner, and every single time, the shot lands exactly where it should. The scope has never been adjusted. It never will be. Some things, when they're built right and cared for properly, don't need to change. They just need someone who understands what they're capable of, someone willing to trust in what has been proven, someone who respects the partnership between shooter and tool enough to let it work the way it was meant to. The cadets learned that lesson on a windy day at Camp Ridgeline. They learned that age is not obsolescence, that experience outweighs electronics, and that sometimes the old ways are old because they work. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that mastery takes a lifetime, that true skill never becomes obsolete, and that respect should be earned by results, not appearances.